Welcome to the Library of Alexandra, a place for curious minds and complicated books, made a little easier to understand. Because the truth is, we all imagine ourselves reading more, learning more, becoming more. But life doesn't always give us the time. So here, we take those dense, intimidating books and turn them into something you can actually absorb and reflect on. If you'd like to keep exploring with me, don't forget to like and subscribe. Then tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Think of it as signing the library guest book, and if you know someone who keeps buying books they never finish, send them this video. The library is calling.
Welcome to today's deep dive. It is Friday, March 6, 2026.
Glad to be here today.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we are immersing ourselves in a mission today that feels really profoundly urgent.
Very urgent.
Maybe more so now than at any point in recent memory, honestly.
I'd have to agree with that.
We are setting out to answer this monumental question for you, the listener. How can you, as an individual, survive the suffocating, crushing pressure of modern mass society?
It's the big question.
Exactly. And to find that answer, we are looking through the lens of the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung.
Fascinating figure.
Truly. So the grounding materials for our exploration today are excerpts from two of his most seminal works. We've got his later book, The Undiscovered Self.
Right.
And his essay, Symbols and the Interpretation of Dreams.
Both incredible texts.
Yeah. And we're also utilizing the context provided by Soner Shamdasani, his 2010 foreword to Jung's legendary Red Book.
Which is just a wild piece of history on its own.
It really is. It sheds so much light on the very personal, almost harrowing methods Jung used to map the human mind, specifically his practice of active imagination.
Yeah, it's a profoundly rich collection of texts to draw from. And Shamdasani's foreword is really the perfect key to unlock it all.
How so?
Well, what that foreword makes clear is that Jung's insights were never just abstract academic theories.
Right, they weren't just born in a library.
Exactly. They were forged in the fires of intense and often terrifying self-experimentation.
That's a great way to put it.
Starting around 1913, just before the catastrophic outbreak of the First World War, Jung deliberately allowed his fantasy thinking to take over his conscious mind.
He just let it off the leash?
Completely off the leash.
Yeah.
He engaged with the deepest layers of his psyche and carefully recorded these bizarre, intense internal dialogues in what he called his black books.
Which later became the Red Book, right?
Right. They were transcribed, meticulously calligraphed and illustrated in the Red Book. He was trying to understand how a human being actually regains their soul. He was diagnosing a contemporary malaise.
Yeah.
Like a deep spiritual alienation.
Yeah.
And the terrifying realization he came to was that the cataclysmic events happening on the world stage—
The war and everything.
Exactly. The massive ideological divides and the mechanized slaughter of the war were actually macrocosmic reflections of the exact same conflicts happening within every single individual's own nature.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that really sets up the stakes for what we're doing today.
It does.
The core mission of this deep dive is to explore why true self-knowledge, specifically understanding the dark, hidden, and deeply symbolic language of your own unconscious mind, why that is presented by Jung as the only valid defense we have against global catastrophe.
And totalitarianism.
Right, the heavy premise. But the journey to understand it is filled with these incredible psychological mysteries.
It's definitely not a dry academic discussion.
Not at all. I mean, we are going to look at why a brilliant philosopher accidentally plagiarized a 17th century sailor without ever realizing it.
That's a crazy story.
Yeah. We'll examine why a common English architectural motif completely baffled a Hindu tourist, and how that misunderstanding reveals the fundamental way our brains process reality.
So important.
And most importantly, we're going to explore why your weirdest, most nonsensical and embarrassing dreams might actually be the primary mechanism keeping your conscious mind from fracturing.
Yeah, to even begin to grasp how Jung reached these conclusions, we have to ground ourselves in the historical reality he was observing.
Right, set the stage for us.
When Jung was writing The Undiscovered Self in the mid-1950s, he was looking out at a world that had just survived the incomprehensible trauma of the Second World War.
Yeah.
only to find itself immediately plunged into the chilling, paralyzing freeze of the Cold War.
Humanity was literally split in two.
Exactly, by what Winston Churchill had dubbed the Iron Curtain. And on top of that, there was the terrifying existential threat of the hydrogen bomb.
For the first time in history.
Right, people were waking up every single day with a very real apocalyptic vision of universal, instantaneous destruction hanging over their heads.
Just a button press away.
So Jung, looking at this geopolitical nightmare, asked a very pointed psychological question.
Which was?
What does this level of massive systemic pressure actually do to the individual human being?
Because when the world gets that massive right, and the mechanisms of state power get that enormous, the individual tends to just shrink into nothingness.
Exactly, they vanish.
And Jung points to the root of this shrinking, which he identifies as the danger of the statistical method or statistical truth.
Which is a huge concept to tackle.
It really challenges the way we structure almost all modern knowledge today. We rely on statistics to tell us what is true about populations and economies and human behavior.
We do, and Jung offers a profound critique of that reliance.
Walk us through it.
He argues that any scientific theory based on mass experience is necessarily statistical. It has to formulate an ideal average to make sense of the data.
Right, you need an average to make a chart.
Exactly. But the philosophical danger is that in creating this average, the statistical method abolishes all exceptions at either end of the scale.
It flattens everything out.
It replaces the messy empirical reality with an abstract mean. Jung uses a very grounded, brilliant analogy to illustrate why this is a problem when applied to human beings.
Oh, the pebble analogy.
Yes. Imagine you have a large riverbed filled with thousands of pebbles.
Okay.
If you take the painstaking time to weigh every single pebble in that bed, add up the total weight, and divide by the number of pebbles, you might calculate that the statistically average weight is exactly 5 ounces.
So the math is flawless.
Perfectly flawless.
It gives you a perfectly rational scientific fact about that group of pebbles.
It does, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the reality of the riverbed.
Right.
If you thought, based on that perfectly accurate statistical finding, that you could walk down to the river, reach in, and easily pick up a pebble weighing exactly 5 ounces on your first try, you would be deeply mistaken.
You probably wouldn't find one at all.
In fact, you could spend weeks searching through that entire bed and never find a single solitary pebble that weighs exactly 5 ounces. The statistical method illuminates the facts in the light of the ideal average, but it completely fails to give us a picture of their empirical reality. The 5-ounce pebble does not exist.
And when Jung applies this to humanity, the implications are just staggering.
They really are.
Because science and sociology create an ideal average human being, a demographic target, an economic unit.
Right. The average consumer.
Exactly. But human reality, actual daily human existence, is the exception to the rule.
Yes.
To truly understand a human being, Jung is saying you have to completely discard the scientific average. Because the individual is a unique, irregular, and singular phenomenon, the average man is an illusion.
It is an illusion.
Yeah.
And it has devastating psychological consequences when it becomes the organizing principle of a society.
How so?
Well, when a government or a culture begins to view people not as unique, irregular exceptions, but as statistical averages, it fundamentally alters the moral landscape.
Right.
It strips the individual of their moral responsibility. If you were just a fraction of a percentage point in a sociological study, your personal moral compass is kind of irrelevant.
You're just data.
Exactly. It's replaced by the policy of the state, which operates on what is known as raison d'etat, reasons of state.
The state becomes the moral center.
Right. The state, representing the statistical mass, becomes the ultimate arbiter of meaning and morality. The individual is no longer a sovereign person making complex moral decisions about their own life.
They're just a unit.
Merely fed, clothed, educated, and amused as a social unit. The entire goal of human life shifts subtly but irrevocably from the difficult task of individual development to the execution of an abstract state policy.
And this shift is what paves the way for what Jung calls mass-mindedness.
Yes.
Because when you aggregate people into these massive, anonymous statistical units, you crush out the space for insight and nuance and reflection.
You lose the individual mind.
Those qualities are only possible within the quiet boundaries of the individual mind. When you pack people together conceptually or physically, you create an environment where rational argument is completely useless.
Especially if the emotional temperature of the crowd rises above a certain critical level.
Which brings us to a terrifying point about latent psychoses.
Yeah, monitoring that rising emotional temperature is absolutely vital because of this psychological reality.
Jung highlights.
Explain the latent psychosis concept, because it's pretty disturbing,
It is. We generally think of mental illness in terms of manifest cases.
right? Like people who are visibly unwell.
Yeah, unable to function, perhaps requiring institutional care. But Jung's clinical experience led him to estimate that for every manifest case of insanity, there are at least 10 latent cases.
10 to 1.
10 to 1. These are individuals who seldom, if ever, break out openly into visible psychosis.
So they just walk around normally.
They hold jobs, they participate in society, but their underlying views, reactions, and behaviors are unconsciously influenced by deeply pathological and perverse factors.
They are walking around with a fundamentally distorted affective relationship to reality.
That ratio fundamentally changes how you look at the fabric of any society. I mean, if 10 out of 11 people with severe psychological distortions are simply masking them in daily life, what happens when the pressure of mass society pushes them?
Well, what happens is that in a highly emotional, mass-minded society, these latent cases suddenly find their perfect ideal environment.
It's like a petri dish for them.
Exactly. Their mental state is already one of being ruled by affective judgments, deeply held resentments, and irrational wish fantasies.
Right.
So when a collective panic strikes or a fervent mass political movement rises, these individuals don't seem crazy at all.
To the crowd, they look like visionaries.
They appear to be the most adapted, the most passionate. They feel quite at home in the chaos.
Because it matches their internal state.
Right, because they intimately know the language of these highly charged, irrational conditions. They inevitably rise to the top of mass movements.
They become the leaders.
They become the fanatical leaders who steer the crowd, not with logic, but through chimerical wish fantasies.
Appealing directly to the collective irrationality.
And the unacknowledged resentments lurking just beneath the surface of all the so-called normal people.
You know, it really makes you wonder about our own daily lives and how we process our identities.
It should.
I mean, whenever you find yourself treated as just a demographic target, an algorithm's output, or a number on a corporate spreadsheet, Jung is essentially arguing that this very feeling of being a microscopic, interchangeable unit is the psychological groundwork for tyranny.
It absolutely is.
It strips your personal autonomy and prepares you to be swept up by whichever latently psychotic leader can shout the loudest and tap into the collective anxiety.
It creates a vacuum. And when the individual's sense of unique purpose is hollowed out by the statistical worldview, the state rushes in to fill that void.
It takes over everything.
It attempts to take the place of everything else in a person's life, up to and including their highest spiritual values.
Which brings us to a crucial, really nuanced distinction Jung makes regarding how humans orient themselves toward the absolute.
Yes, the religion versus creed distinction.
He draws a very sharp line between a creed and a religion. And that distinction really shifts the perspective because in everyday language, we treat those words as complete synonyms.
I do. We talk about someone's creed or someone's religion interchangeably.
But Jung splits them wide open and says they are actually fundamentally different psychological experiences.
He does. For Jung, a creed is a codified public institution. It is a confession of faith that is intended chiefly for the world at large.
Like an organization.
Exactly. Because a creed is an institution, it has to exist in the mundane physical world. And anything that exists in the mundane world inevitably has to make compromises with the state.
And with worldly reality, just to survive and maintain its power structure.
Right. A creed becomes a matter of tradition, social expectation, and collective belief.
Okay, so what is religion then?
Religion, on the other hand, derives from the Latin religio, which implies a careful consideration and observation of certain invisible dynamic factors.
Okay.
Jung defines true religion as a deeply subjective empirical relationship to an extra-mundane, meaning literally out-of-this-world authority.
So it's not about the rules.
It is not about agreeing to a list of institutional rules.
Yeah.
It is a direct, intensely personal, and often overwhelming experience of a transcendent reality.
So the creed is the architecture, the dogma, the public social gathering, and the political compromises.
Yes.
But religion is the actual unmediated inner experience of the divine or the infinite that happens within the individual psyche.
Exactly.
And Jung argues that this specific psychological distinction is a matter of absolute life and death for the individual living in a mass society.
It is the only defense mechanism.
How does that work?
Well, Jung posits that to turn a human being into a mere function of the state, a willing gear in the machine, the state must absolutely destroy true religion. Because if an individual has a direct empirical relationship with an extra-mundane authority, they have a point of reference that exists outside the physical world.
They have a place to stand.
They have an immovable place to stand that allows them to judge the actions of the state and resist its absolute claims.
Right. If your ultimate anchor is in an authority that is not of this world, the state does not own you.
You cannot be fully assimilated into the mass. Therefore, the dictator state, by its very nature, must swallow up the individual's religious forces.
It has to become God.
The state must deify itself. It must become the false god.
I am trying to reconcile this with how dictator states actually operate based on the text.
Sure.
It is not just about banning books or bulldozing religious buildings. Those are crude methods. The truly insidious thing, Jung points out, is that the dictator state actually steals the psychological tools of religion to achieve this deification.
It hijacks the human instinct for the divine.
Exactly.
Dictatorial states utilize magic and ritual.
But they don't call it that.
No, they obviously do not label it as such. They frame it as patriotism or civic duty. They utilize massive parades, towering banners, brass bands, and monster demonstrations.
Right.
But if you look at the psychological mechanics of what these events are actually doing, they're providing the exact same psychological feeling of security and unity that religious rites historically provided.
Like in antiquity.
Yeah, in antiquity, people performed solemn, intricate rites to protect themselves from invisible powers, natural disasters, and their own inner demons.
So the modern state just swapped out the symbols.
The modern mass state stages these overwhelming parades of state power to engender a collective feeling of invulnerability.
The marching boots.
The hypnotic rhythm of marching boots, the sheer scale of the crowd. It all works to quell the individual's inner anxieties by submerging their ego completely in the mass.
It demands that religious output.
The state demands the emotional output of religion.
Yeah.
Absolute enthusiasm, endless self-sacrifice, and unquestioning love.
And fear.
Yes, and just as historically some religious institutions relied heavily on the fear of God to maintain order, the dictator state takes very good care to provide the necessary pervasive terror to keep everyone perfectly in line.
So the deeply ingrained psychological function of religion is completely displaced onto the political apparatus.
Completely.
Now, it is really crucial to pause here and emphasize to you listening that we are exploring this strictly through Jung's psychological and analytical lens.
Wait, this is a psychological analysis.
The source text is analyzing the mechanics of 20th century political movements across the board without endorsing any political ideology.
We are just looking at the architecture of totalitarianism itself, as Jung described it.
Exactly. And Jung issues a very stark, unsettling warning to the Western democracies in this text. He basically says the West shouldn't sit back and feel inherently superior or uniquely safe from this exact dynamic.
His warning to the West is perhaps the most chilling part of his analysis.
Because we think we're immune.
Right? Jung argues that the Western world is equally, if not more, vulnerable, precisely because it has wholly embraced the same rationalistic statistical worldview that paves the way for mass-mindedness.
We love our statistics.
We do. The West has heavily invested its faith in the scientific, materialistic outlook that reduces the individual to a predictable number.
So what happens when that's challenged?
Well, when a supposedly rational society is suddenly faced with the unleashing of primal emotional forces and religious-like political fanaticism, how does it respond?
It appeals to reason.
It appeals to reason and idealism.
Oh.
It tries to argue with the mob using statistics and logic.
Which doesn't work.
Jung says this is like trying to stop a hurricane with a puff of wind.
That's a great image.
You cannot fight a deeply emotional, quasi-religious psychic epidemic with rational arguments or moral exhortations. It is utterly useless.
Because the mob isn't operating on logic.
It's exactly. The West, having largely discarded the subjective experience of the numinous, lacks a uniform faith of a non-materialistic kind that could actually anchor the individual and block the progress of a fanatical ideology.
We cling to the belief that our logic, our laws, and our spreadsheets will save us from the madness of crowds.
But they won't.
But Jung is revealing that the madness operates on a much deeper, more primal frequency where logic simply does not register.
Right.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that brings us to the psychological root of all this global division.
Yes.
Jung looks at the geographical Iron Curtain that physically divided the world during the Cold War, And he doesn't just see a geopolitical border drawn by politicians.
He sees a mirror reflecting the human mind.
It is a profound realization. Jung views the physical Iron Curtain as a macroscopic manifestation of a deep psychological split running right through the center of modern man.
We are physically and politically divided in the external world because our internal psyches are severely divided.
We are split.
We have lost our inner wholeness. We have severed the connection between our conscious rational minds and our deep instinctual unconscious.
And because we are split inside.
Because we refuse to acknowledge the darker aspects of our own nature.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We engage in a psychological defense mechanism known as projection.
Yes, projection is a massive concept here.
It requires a deep dive all on its own because it is something every single human being does, usually without any awareness.
All the time.
Projection is the process where we take our own unrecognized evil, our own dark, aggressive, selfish, or inferior qualities that we cannot bear to admit we possess.
We can't even look at them.
Right, and we cast them outward onto our neighbors or onto the other side.
Right.
We look across the political aisle or across a national border, and we see absolute monsters. We see the devil incarnate.
But what are we really seeing?
We are really seeing the unacknowledged shadow of our own psyche staring back at us.
Jung is entirely uncompromising on this point, and it is a bitter pill for the conscious ego to swallow.
Nobody wants to hear this.
No, because he insists that human nature inherently contains evil. We desperately like to think of ourselves as basically good, rational creatures who occasionally make mistakes.
Right.
But Jung argues that we are all potential criminals.
He goes back to original sin, right?
Yeah, he points out that tracing the concept of original sin back to Adam's relatively innocent slip-up with Eve in the garden is almost a cute, comforting euphemism.
Compared to the reality.
Compared to the gigantic, terrifying proportions of actual human evil.
Wow.
The capacity for terrible, calculated destruction is not an anomaly. It is lodged deeply in human nature itself. It is a fundamental part of our biological and psychological inheritance.
To illustrate how this operates, even among the most highly educated and well-intentioned among us, Jung uses this deeply unsettling example from the text about the atomic physicists.
The ones who developed the hydrogen bomb.
Exactly. These individuals were not comic book villains plotting the end of the world.
No, they were brilliant, dedicated scientists.
Seeking ultimate truth. They dedicated their lives to intellectual discovery with immense self-sacrifice. And yet, what was the actual result of their pure, conscious pursuit of scientific light?
The creation of a weapon capable of incinerating humanity.
It perfectly encapsulates his warning.
It does. The conscious mind may earnestly seek knowledge progress and the betterment of mankind, but the unconscious mind always has its finger in the pie.
Always.
If the unconscious is ignored, if the shadow is not integrated into our conscious awareness, it will assert its own dark intentions through our actions, despite our best conscious intentions.
So it pushes us toward violence anyway.
In the case of the bomb, the unconscious drive toward destruction pushed humanity toward an invention of ultimate violence, all under the guise of scientific progress.
Because we wouldn't look at the shadow.
Right. It demonstrates definitively that reason alone is no longer sufficient to protect us. As our conscious intellect has broadened and our technology has become exponentially more powerful, our moral and emotional nature has lagged dangerously behind.
We possess the technology of gods, but the psychological maturity of terrified primates.
Exactly.
That terrifying gap between our technology and our psychological maturity is where Jung issues this massive warning about the danger of harmlessness.
Oh, this is a fascinating point.
Because we tend to operate under the assumption that if we just act nice, follow the rules, and view ourselves as purely good, rational people, we are safe.
We think harmlessness is a virtue.
Right. But Jung says this is absolute dangerous naivete.
It is worse than naivete because it actively makes the world more dangerous.
How does being nice make it dangerous?
Well, thinking you are purely good and rational completely deprives you of the capacity to deal with evil both in the external world and within yourself.
Because you don't even believe it exists in you.
If you do not recognize the shadow within your own psyche, you will inevitably project it onto the unrecognized evil in the other.
Right.
This does two very dangerous things.
Yeah.
First, it blinds you to your own capacity for harm, making you capable of committing atrocities while convinced of your own righteousness.
Which is how every terrible regime operates.
Exactly. Second, it considerably increases the formidableness of the threat from the other side.
Because you're adding your own fear to it.
Right. When you look at your enemy, you are not just seeing their actual objective flaws. Your projection carries all the secret terror and disgust you feel for your own inner evil, making the enemy appear as an invincible demonic force that must be utterly destroyed.
It is a deeply uncomfortable concept to sit with for you listening right now, especially in a highly polarized world.
Very uncomfortable.
When you look at the political opposition or the people you vehemently clash with in your daily life, how much of their perceived monstrousness is actual objective reality,
Right.
and how much is just your own unacknowledged psychological shadow projected onto them?
Are they truly the ultimate threat to civilization, or are they unknowingly carrying the weight of the dark side of your own human nature?
It challenges the entire premise of how we engage in conflict.
It is perhaps the most uncomfortable realization a person can have, which is exactly why our egos build such elaborate defenses to actively avoid it.
But Jung insists that recognizing the shadow is the only path to genuine humility.
It's the only way.
It is the modesty we need to acknowledge our own deep imperfections. And that honest acknowledgement of our shared capacity for evil is the true solid basis for human relationship, not some high-flying, flawless, and ultimately brittle idealism.
But the obvious question arises, right? If we are so completely blind to our own shadow, how do we actually bridge this gap?
How do we heal the split psyche?
How do we stop projecting our internal darkness onto the world?
And this is where the deep dive transitions from diagnosing the disease to exploring the cure.
Yes.
Jung doesn't just leave us stranded in the dark with our unrecognized evil. He points us toward a mechanism that is constantly trying to heal this split completely independent of our conscious will.
The unconscious.
That mechanism is the language of the unconscious, which speaks to us primarily through dreams and symbols.
But to understand how this language works, we have to grasp a fundamental distinction Jung makes between a sign and a symbol.
Right, he uses this brilliant, almost comical analogy to clarify this.
It's a very clarifying story that perfectly illustrates the limits of our perception.
Tell the story.
So Jung tells of a Hindu man who is visiting England. After spending some time observing the culture and touring the architecture, the tourist confidently told his friends back home that the English actually worshipped animals.
Which sounds insane.
Right. Why did he come to this bizarre conclusion? Because he went into old British churches and grand cathedrals and repeatedly saw prominent carvings and statues of eagles, lions, and oxen.
Okay.
Coming from a culture where animal deities are worshipped, he interpreted the visual data literally.
He thought they were literal animal gods.
He didn't realize that in the Western Christian context, these animals were not literal deities to be worshipped. They were signs representing the evangelists, the eagle for John, the lion for Mark, the ox for Luke.
So he saw the literal object but entirely missed the specific known historical concept it was pointing to.
Exactly.
This perfectly sets up the crucial distinction we need to make. What exactly makes a sign different from a symbol in Jungian psychology?
It is a difference of depth and knowability.
Okay, break that down.
A sign points to a known thing. It is an abbreviation or a stand-in for a concept that is already fully understood by the conscious mind.
Like the eagle.
The eagle in the cathedral is a sign for the evangelist John. The abbreviation UN on a blue helmet is a sign for the United Nations. A red octagon on the street is a sign to stop.
We know exactly what they denote. There is no mystery.
But a symbol is entirely different. A symbol points to something largely unknown.
Unknown.
It is an expression of a profound, hidden, or transcendent idea that cannot be fully captured by language or rational thought. It points toward a reality where our intellectual reason must eventually capitulate.
Jung uses the example of the wheel in the text, right?
Yes, a wheel is a completely common mundane object. We all know what it is. But when a wheel is used symbolically, say in ancient religious iconography or profound dream, it might point to the idea of a divine sun or the cyclical nature of time, life, death, and eternity.
Things we can't easily define.
We cannot perfectly define or empirically prove the existence of a divine sun or the infinite cycle of time. Our intellect hits a wall.
The symbol carries a wider unconscious aspect that can never be fully exhausted by a rational dictionary explanation.
It promises vastly more than it reveals.
And the most important aspect of this is that we cannot invent symbols.
No, you cannot.
You cannot just sit down at a desk and decide to create a genuine psychological symbol. They occur to us spontaneously rising up from the depths, primarily in our dreams.
And this realization about the spontaneous, autonomous nature of symbols is what eventually led Jung to break away from his mentor, Sigmund Freud.
Specifically regarding the methodology of how to interpret these dreams.
Right. Freud used a method called free association.
Which is famous.
It is. In free association, the analyst takes a single image from a patient's dream and just asks the patient to talk, letting them jump from one thought to the next, seeing where the chain of associations naturally leads.
Whatever pops into their head.
It's exactly. Freud firmly believed this unguided wandering would eventually lead back to the repressed sexual traumas or aggressive wishes that he believed were causing the patient's neurosis.
But Jung noticed a massive fundamental flaw in this method.
A huge flaw.
If you just follow any random chain of thought, does it actually tell you anything about the dream itself?
No.
The epiphany that solidified his critique happened during a train ride in Russia with a colleague. Can you unpack that anecdote from the text? Because it completely dismantled the free association approach for Jung.
Yeah, it's a great story. So Jung's colleague was incredibly bored on this long, monotonous train journey through Russia.
Before smartphones.
Long before. So to pass the time, he started looking at the Cyrillic letters on the railway notices posted in his compartment. He couldn't read a word of Cyrillic, so he just started free associating to the physical shapes of the letters.
Just looking at the shapes.
Letting his mind wander from the random geometric shapes to whatever thoughts spontaneously popped into his head.
And what happened?
Within a very short time, this unguided chain of free association led him straight into his deepest, most disagreeable psychological complexes.
His neuroses.
The very anxieties and neuroses he actively spent his life trying to avoid thinking about.
That is the crucial point. He didn't even have a dream.
He was wide awake.
He was wide awake just staring at random train signs. And Jung realized that free association will always lead to your underlying psychological complexes no matter what your starting point is.
Always. You could start with a profound dream, a crack in the plaster on the wall, or Russian train signs, and all roads will eventually lead to Rome.
Rome being your core neuroses.
Exactly. Therefore, free association completely ignores the specific, unique message of the dream itself.
Because if every dream, no matter how detailed or bizarre, just leads back to the exact same complex, then why did the unconscious go through the trouble of choosing this specific image in this specific narrative tonight?
Precisely. If we just free associate and wander away from the image, we lose sight of the dream entirely. We impose our waking anxieties onto the unconscious.
So what's the alternative?
Jung argued that instead of wandering away, we must circumambulate the dream.
Circumambulate. Walk around it.
Imagine the dream image is a sculpture in the center of a room. You don't walk away from it, you walk around it. You look at it from all angles. You stick strictly to the specific images the dream chose to present.
The dream is its own limitation.
We have to ask a much harder question. What is the unconscious specifically trying to convey by choosing this exact bizarre scenario instead of any other?
And the scenarios the unconscious chooses can be incredibly concrete, primitive, and sometimes brutally insulting.
Because the unconscious is trying to bypass our intellectual stubbornness.
When our conscious ego gets too rigid, the unconscious hits back with imagery we just can't ignore. There are a couple of fascinating clinical anecdotes from Jung's practice in the text that illustrate this concrete language perfectly.
The man with the drunk wife.
Yes. For instance, there was a man who came to Jung who consciously believed with absolute conviction that he was a perfect, upstanding, flawless gentleman.
Very prim and proper.
But he reported a recurring dream where his wife was acting like a vulgar, disheveled, completely out of control drunk. Now, the key here is that in waking reality, his wife was nothing like this.
She was perfectly respectable.
So what was the dream actually saying if it wasn't literal?
Well, if Jung had used free association, he might have led the man to discover some repressed childhood memory about his mother. But by circumambulating the dream, Jung looked at the specific image itself.
Sticking to the sculpture.
The dream was presenting a degenerate female figure who was closely connected to the dreamer. Jung understood this not as a literal truth about the man's wife, but as a deeply symbolic representation of the man's own anima.
The anima. Explain that for us.
In Jungian psychology, the anima is the unconscious feminine side of a man's personality. It often contains his inferior, less developed emotional relatedness, his moods, and his irrational feelings.
Okay.
Because this man's conscious ego was so rigidly identified with being a perfect gentleman, he had completely repressed his messy, emotional, irrational side.
He shoved it in the basement.
The psyche, which always seeks equilibrium, could not let this extreme lopsidedness continue. So the dream held up a mirror, using a shocking concrete image of a degenerate woman to say, Basically,
you think you are a flawless saint, but your hidden emotional life, which you refuse to acknowledge, is behaving like a vulgar drunk.
it was a direct, savage hit designed to balance his consciously constructed fiction.
It is the psyche acting as an incredibly harsh corrective mechanism.
Very harsh.
And it doesn't just use shocking imagery, it uses whatever primitive language is necessary to get past our defenses. There's another great example in the reading.
A stubborn lady.
Yeah, Jung had a patient who was a very stubborn lady, full of incredibly rigid, stupid prejudices. She absolutely refused to listen to any rational arguments from her doctor.
An intellectual brick wall.
Parrying every logical point Jung tried to make, so her unconscious stepped in to do the heavy lifting.
I love this dream.
She dreamt she was invited to a very prestigious high society affair. Her sophisticated hostess welcomed her warmly at the door, saying all her friends were waiting inside, and led her through a door straight into a literal cowshed.
It is a brilliant, almost comedic psychological intervention by the unconscious mind.
A herd of cows.
The doctor's rational arguments were completely useless against her entrenched intellect, but the dream utilizes a drastic, undeniably primitive and concrete language.
It bypasses the intellect entirely.
And speaks directly to her pride. It basically tells her this highly prized social and intellectual circle you fiercely defend is in reality nothing but a herd of cows.
It is a visual metaphor simple enough for anyone to intuitively grasp.
And she couldn't help but get the self-inflicted joke. The dream slipped past her intellectual armor and hit her on an emotional, symbolic level, forcing a realization that logic never could.
This completely reframes how we view the unconscious.
Complete.
We often culturally think of the unconscious as just a passive storage locker, a dusty basement where we throw our repressed memories and childhood trauma and lock the door.
But Jung is demonstrating that it is incredibly active.
It has its own agency.
Which brings us to the mechanics of the subliminal mind. What else is going on down there besides repressed memories?
Right. It's not just old trauma.
It is a profoundly dynamic, creative, and perceptive space. It certainly contains forgotten memories and repressed trauma, but that is only a fraction of its contents.
What else?
It also contains subliminal perceptions, things we see, hear, or smell in our daily lives without our conscious mind ever registering them.
Our senses pick up vast amounts of data that bypass the ego.
And go straight into the unconscious. More importantly, it contains entirely new creative thoughts and ideas that are gestating in the dark and haven't yet crossed the threshold into consciousness.
So it's building things.
The unconscious is a source of profound original creativity, synthesizing data in ways the conscious mind cannot fathom.
And sometimes the way the unconscious holds on to and resurfaces this information is genuinely mind-blowing.
Truly.
We have to talk about the phenomenon of cryptomnesia, or concealed recollection from the text.
This is one of my favorite parts.
It is one of the most astonishing stories in all of psychology, and it involves the famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche
Yes.
in his philosophical masterpiece, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche wrote a very specific, incredibly bizarre scene. Zarathustra descends into a volcano, and as he flies past, there is a ship anchored at an island, and the crew is on shore shooting rabbits.
It's a very weird, highly specific set of narrative images.
That seemed to spring entirely from Nietzsche's poetic imagination.
It does seem entirely original. But Jung, being an incredibly well-read polymath, recognized those specific images.
He'd seen it before.
He remembered reading an obscure book by a German physician named Justinus Kerner, published around 1835.
Okay.
This book contained an extract from an actual ship's log dating all the way back to 1686.
1686.
The historical log described an incident where a ship anchored off the volcanic island of Mount Stromboli. The crew went ashore to shoot rabbits for food.
Rabbits.
When they returned to the ship, they reported seeing two figures flying through the air, who then descended into the terrible crater of the volcano.
The narrative parallels are not just vaguely similar, they are almost word-for-word identical.
The ship, the rabbits, the flying, figures the descent into the volcano.
But the immediate assumption would be plagiarism, right?
Naturally.
Except Nietzsche didn't intentionally plagiarize this. He wasn't a hack trying to steal a 17th century sailor's story to pad out his philosophy. So how on earth did a 200-year-old ship's log end up perfectly replicated in his greatest work?
Jung was fascinated by this, so he did some deep investigative digging. He eventually contacted Nietzsche's sister.
And what did he find?
He discovered that when Nietzsche was just 11 years old, he had read that exact obscure book by Kerner. His conscious mind had completely forgotten the story over the intervening decades. But his unconscious mind had retained the exact imagery, the specific details of the volcano, the ship, the rabbits, like a flawless high-definition recording.
Just sitting there waiting.
Decades later, during the intense flow of creative writing, the unconscious perfectly reproduced that memory, presenting it to Nietzsche's conscious mind.
And Nietzsche experienced it as a spontaneous, original poetic creation.
Completely unaware it was a concealed recollection. This demonstrates the terrifying power in the depth of the subliminal mind.
It really does.
It holds on to things with a grip we cannot consciously fathom and can serve them up as absolute reality.
It makes you question the nature of inspiration entirely. Like, how much of our own original thought or subtle epiphanies is just our unconscious serving up something we vaguely glanced at on a screen 5 years ago?
Just humbling thought.
But the unconscious doesn't just passively store old sailor yarns to spit back out later. Jung is adamant that it actively tries to keep us alive.
It functions as an autonomous survival mechanism.
Jung says dreams act as compensations and warnings. They continuously try to balance out our lopsided, dangerous conscious attitudes.
Yeah.
If you have grandiose, unrealistic plans, the unconscious will often send you dreams of falling from a great height or flying too close to the sun. It is trying to literally psychologically ground you before you destroy yourself.
And the tragic reality is that if we persistently ignore these warnings, the unconscious predictions can manifest in physical reality.
Jung shares a very sobering, tragic clinical anecdote about this.
The mountain climber.
Yeah. He had a patient, a man who was inextricably involved in very shady, illicit, and highly dangerous business affairs.
Right, his waking life was a moral mess.
As a psychological compensation for his deeply compromised, grubby life, this man developed an almost morbid, obsessive passion for extremely dangerous mountain climbing.
He was unconsciously trying to literally get above himself.
Right, to escape the moral filth of his shady dealings by seeking the pure, elevated heights of the mountains.
But his unconscious saw exactly what he was doing and the danger he was putting himself in.
And he started having a terrifying recurring dream. In the dream, he saw himself stepping off the summit of a high mountain straight into the empty air.
When Jung heard this dream, he was immediately alarmed. He didn't see it as a metaphor for career failure. He saw it as a literal urgent warning.
He warned the man insistently.
He told him that the dream was a clear prediction of his death in a mountain accident. The unconscious was showing him that his drive to get above himself was going to result in a fatal fall.
Did the man listen?
Jung begged the man to restrain himself to stop climbing immediately, but the man was too possessed by his conscious compulsion. He wouldn't listen to the doctor, and more importantly, he wouldn't listen to the explicit warning of his own unconscious mind.
And what happened?
6 months later, while climbing with a friend, a guide watched him do something inexplicable. The guide reported that the man simply let go of a rope and stepped off the ledge as if he were jumping into the air.
He just stepped off.
He fell, and tragically both he and his friend were killed.
It is absolutely chilling. The dream wasn't a magic trick, and it wasn't supernatural clairvoyance. It was the unconscious mind perfectly perceiving a latent self-destructive urge that the conscious mind absolutely refused to acknowledge.
And because the conscious mind wouldn't listen, the unconscious played it out to its fatal conclusion.
There's another example in the text that operates on the exact same mechanics but with a slightly different outcome.
The lady in the woods.
A lady who lived in a complete fantasy of austere distinction. She believed she was above the gritty, dark animal realities of life.
She was disconnected.
She started having shocking, unsavory, terrifying dreams about the lonely woods where she liked to take long, soulful walks. The dreams were menacing, explicitly warning her of raw physical danger in those specific woods.
And just like the mountain climber, her conscious ego was too rigid. She indignantly refused to acknowledge that the dreams had any validity.
She thought she was above it all.
She believed her austere distinction protected her. She ignored the warning and continued her walks. And a week later, she was viciously attacked by a pervert in those exact woods, barely escaping with her life.
Jung points out the uncomfortable psychological truth here too, right?
He does. She likely had a secret, completely unconscious longing for some sort of intense, raw adventure to break through her sterile, austere fantasy.
Wow.
Her unconscious perceived this dangerous longing, and the risk it placed her in warned her. And when ignored, she paid the price of broken ribs and severe trauma to find out the truth of her own vulnerability.
The unconscious is not a benevolent, coddling fairy godmother.
It is a profound force of nature. It can be incredibly beautiful and healing, but it can also be ruthlessly cruel if its attempts at compensation are ignored.
Which brings us to the absolute necessity of learning to interpret this language.
We have to learn it.
But as Jung explicitly warns, dream interpretation is not a mechanical technique. You can't just buy a dream dictionary, look up volcano or rabbit or vulgar wife, and get a neat answer.
It doesn't work like that.
Therapy and the interpretation of the unconscious is a dialectic. It is a living, breathing, often highly fraught clash of personalities between the analyst and the patient.
This is where Jung's framework of psychology becomes incredibly practical. Because the analysis is a confrontation between two unique individuals, it matters deeply how their minds are fundamentally oriented toward reality.
Which led to his types.
Yes, this led Jung to develop his concept of psychological types. He broadly categorized human consciousness into two main attitude types: extroverts and introverts.
Now, we use these words constantly today. If someone likes parties, we call them an extrovert. If they like reading at home, we call them an introvert.
But Jung meant something vastly more profound and systemic than just social preference.
Vastly more. Tell us what he meant.
For Jung, the extrovert is oriented primarily by the objective external world, by objects, other people, external facts, and societal norms. Their psychic energy flows outward. The introvert, however, is oriented primarily by the inner subjective world. They process reality through their own internal reception of events, their inner concepts and archetypes. Their psychic energy flows inward.
Now, imagine an analytical setting. If an analyst is a strong extrovert and the patient is a strong introvert, they might clash immediately on a fundamental level of reality.
They absolutely would.
What the extrovert values, adapting to the outer world, taking tangible action, the introvert might find superficial, overwhelming, or even repulsive.
And conversely, what the introvert values, deep introspection lingering on internal images, the extrovert might view as morbid self-absorption or a failure to adapt to reality.
Right. If the analyst tries to force their extroverted worldview onto the introverted patient's dream, they will completely destroy the meaning of the symbol.
And to make the map of the mind even more granular, Jung broke down how consciousness orients itself into four functions.
The four functions, think of these as the four cardinal directions on a compass of the mind. Everyone has all four, but we heavily prefer one or two.
Exactly. Let's trace the compass. First, you have sensation.
Sensation.
Sensation is the psychological function that simply tells you that something exists. It is your raw, sensory perception of physical reality without any judgment attached.
It just is.
Then moving around the compass, you have thinking. Thinking tells you what that thing is. It is the intellectual cognitive faculty of categorization, logical deduction, and naming.
Okay.
Third is feeling. Now, it is crucial to understand, Jung does not mean emotion or mood here. Feeling, in this context, is a rational function of valuation.
It evaluates.
It tells you if the thing is agreeable or disagreeable, good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable. It assigns value.
And finally,
you have intuition. Intuition is an irrational function. It tells you where a thing comes from and where it is going. It is a hunch. It perceives hidden possibilities, background processes, and future dynamics without any conscious logical proof.
so if I am a person who relies entirely on thinking and sensation, I only believe in what I can logically prove and physically touch, and I go to an analyst who relies heavily on intuition and feeling, we are practically speaking different languages.
You wouldn't understand each other.
If that analyst tries to interpret my dream using their intuition, forcing my psyche into their theoretical box, it's not just unhelpful, it's a violation of my psychological reality.
This exact clash of types and functions is what caused the final unbridgeable historic break between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud.
And incredibly, that profound professional and philosophical rupture all culminated in the interpretation of a single legendary dream.
It is arguably one of the most famous and consequential dreams in the history of psychology.
Set the scene for us.
The setting is 1909. Jung and Freud are traveling together on a ship to America to give a series of lectures.
Just the two of them.
Right. And they're spending hours every day analyzing each other's dreams. One night, Jung has a profoundly vivid dream. He dreams that he is in a house, and he somehow knows it is his house. He finds himself on the first floor in a cozy drawing room, furnished nicely in an 18th century style. It's pleasant, but he suddenly realizes he has never actually seen this room before.
Driven by curiosity, he starts to explore his own house. He goes downstairs to the ground floor, and the atmosphere changes.
It gets older.
It is much darker. The walls are heavily paneled, and the furniture dates from the 16th century or even earlier. His curiosity peaks. He explores further and finds a heavy door.
Behind it is a flight of stone steps leading down into the cellar.
He descends and enters a beautiful vaulted room. The walls are incredibly ancient, unmistakable Roman brickwork.
But the descent doesn't stop there. As he explores the Roman cellar, he finds an iron ring set into a heavy stone slab on the floor.
He pulls it up.
He pulls it up, revealing another, even narrower flight of stone stairs. He descends into absolute darkness, entering a prehistoric cave.
And what's in the cave?
Scattered on the dust of the cave floor are two ancient human skulls, some bones, and broken shards of primitive pottery. And then he wakes up.
It is an epic, multi-layered descent through time. So Jung, treating Freud as his mentor, tells him this dream. And what is Freud's reaction?
Freud, who's completely locked into his own rigid theories of repressed sexual desires and aggressive death wishes, ignores the house, ignores the Roman cellar, and zeroes in immediately and exclusively on the two skulls in the cave.
Gus the skulls.
He insisted, based on his theory, that the skulls must represent a secret death wish. He relentlessly interrogated Jung. Who are the skulls? Who do you secretly want dead? Is it your wife? Is it your sister?
Freud could only interpret the dream through the highly specific, incredibly rigid lens of his own theoretical box.
But as Jung sat there being interrogated, he had a massive paradigm-shifting intuition.
What did he realize?
He realized this dream wasn't about a death wish toward his family at all. The dream was a topographical map of his own mind, and by extension, a map of the historical evolution of human consciousness itself.
The 18th century top floor was his conscious, modern, waking ego.
Right.
The 16th century floor was his deeper, slightly older historical and cultural heritage.
Exactly.
The Roman cellar represented the deep foundations of Western civilization still lingering unconsciously in his psyche.
Yes.
And that prehistoric cave with the skulls, that was the deepest layer of the objective unconscious, what he would later call the collective unconscious.
It represented the primitive, animalistic, ancestral roots of humanity that we all carry within us, completely independent of our personal waking lives.
It was a beautiful, expansive, profound map of the human psyche. But Jung looked across at Freud, saw how obsessively, almost aggressively dogmatic Freud was about his death wish theory, and realized in that moment that Freud would never, ever understand him.
So what did he do?
To avoid a fatal, explosive fight with his mentor, Jung lied. He made up a story on the spot about associating the skulls with certain family members just to appease Freud's dogma.
But the damage was done.
In that moment, Jung realized the ultimate truth of psychological analysis. You cannot force a living, breathing, unique human individual into a preconceived abstract theory.
You must treat the human psyche as a unique, independent reality.
And that takeaway from Jung's break with Freud is the essential concluding lesson for our mission today. We begin by asking how the individual survives the crushing weight of mass society.
The answer is that we cannot look to external authorities to give us our reality.
Whether that external authority is a rigid psychological theory, a political ideology, a mass movement, or the statistical average of the state.
Submitting to it means losing your soul.
The only way to save the world from the apocalyptic latent psychoses of mass-mindedness is for the individual to turn inward.
You must undertake the incredibly difficult, often frightening task of exploring your own house.
You must be willing to descend into the cellar, recognize your own shadow, integrate your capacity for evil, and learn the symbolic, primitive language of your own instincts as they speak to you unvarnished through your dreams.
Which brings us full circle. The geopolitical health of the entire world depends entirely on the internal psychic health of the individual.
If you do not know yourself, if you refuse to look in the basement of your own mind, you are easily swept up by the madness of the crowd.
You become nothing more than the statistical average, perfectly capable of projecting your darkest, unrecognized evils onto your neighbor while convinced of your own absolute righteousness.
It is a heavy, immense responsibility for you listening, but it is also deeply empowering.
Very empowering.
You are not just a helpless unit in a vast demographic machine. You contain multitudes. You carry the entire history of human consciousness, from the prehistoric cave to the modern drawing room within your own mind.
By engaging with your unconscious, by circumambulating your dreams, and respecting the profound symbols that arise spontaneously from within, you build an inner anchor.
You cultivate a true religion, an empirical relationship to the depths of your own being that no state, no mass movement, and no algorithm can ever uproot.
That's a powerful thought.
It is a profound call to individual action. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. It builds directly on a warning Jung gives in the text, but applied to our reality today.
I'm intrigued.
Jung points out that man's unique learning capacity and our reliance on intellect has caused a severe, dangerous alienation from our instinctual foundations. We have pulled ourselves up into a purely conceptual world where abstract concepts have replaced physical, instinctual reality.
We live entirely in our heads, not our bodies.
Right. Now consider this. Jung wrote those words in the 1950s. Look at us today in 2026. As our world becomes increasingly virtual, increasingly digital, and completely artificial, we are pushing our conscious minds further away from our biological animal instincts than ever before in human history.
We really are.
We are living in metaverses. Our human interactions are entirely mediated by glowing screens and predictive algorithms.
So what's the consequence?
Well, if, as Jung proved, the unconscious mind always acts to compensate for our conscious attitudes, what happens when our conscious attitude becomes entirely divorced from physical reality?
Will the unconscious rebel?
Exactly. Will our unconscious minds eventually violently rebel against this sanitized digital existence? Will our dreams have to generate entirely new, terrifyingly concrete and primitive symbols just to shock us out of the metaverse and force us back into the reality of our physical, biological bodies?
Wow.
Or will this ultimate unprecedented split between our natural instincts and our digital consciousness trigger a new kind of societal psychosis, a mass-mindedness of the digital age that even Carl Jung couldn't have predicted?
That is a terrifying thought.
It is something to seriously think about the next time you put on a headset or find yourself losing an hour to an endless algorithmic scroll.
Definitely.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex, brilliant mind of Carl Jung. It has been an incredible, challenging journey.
And we hope it has given you a profound new lens through which to view not just the external world, but the vast, undiscovered depths of your own inner life.
Until next time, keep exploring and pay attention to your dreams.